Chapter 23, Alexander 21, July 19th, 45,674 BC. The miles-high, massive sheets of ice that covered the rest of Tuwala were moving ever closer to threatening the palace and the palace grounds, and were visible equidistant in every direction, still quite a distance away, but close enough that the smell of the frozen wastes were already upon them, the air crisped with the underlying bitterness that Hemhut kept in check. And as time went on, he found it more and more challenging to stave off the deep freeze as it ever slowly continued to intrude upon them. Lylin and Fate were happy, and so too was the giant. He knew that she was dead, but he refused to accept it, and was still fighting it, keeping her as a doll, a puppet, to enact that which he fantasized could have been the events of a further prolonged life with his love. He knew that when he spoke to her that he was in reality talking to himself, but he did not care. He did not want to lose her, did not want to be sad, and most of all, he did not want to be alone, so he didn't. He did instead what he wanted to do. He kept her, and kept her memory alive, and they were happy, all the three of them that were truly one. The flower wreath he had woven for her in the night was yellow, orange, and red, three of her absolute favorite colors. It sat a little cockeyed atop her head as they walked through the flower garden, talking and laughing, and he adjusted and straightened it for her. She was still subtly continuing to appear younger and younger, and with having now been dead for over 50 years, she was starting to look more and more like the child that had called him from the mountain, a far cry from the reality of her true dilapidated state. As she had always done, she asked him lots of questions, and as he had always done, he would droll on with unnecessarily long elaborate answers aimed at giving her a true understanding of things. Lylin didn't seem to mind it, though, the inane drudgery of dissecting perspective. She loved talking to him about anything and everything, and he loved talking to her, and especially loved her unending curiosity. It seemed that this pattern of give and take between them was endless and self-perpetuating, as every time she learned something new, it would only spawn 10 more questions. As they walked on through the fragrant garden fields, Lylin, twirling and swaying in time with the music he had playing in the air, asked him, "How does the amalgamator work?" "What do you mean?" He looked down at her and watched her move. "I mean, how did it take all the other Tuwalans apart and store them, and how will it later put them back together the way you say?" she asked. "Well, that is another great question, my love, and the road to the answer is profound, and will reveal yet another deeper layer to reality, a conundrum that which I've never before burdened you with, so as not to send you over the edge. So, before I tell you, let me ask you something," Hemhut said in his deep gray voice. "How certain are you that existence is real?" "I don't know how to answer that question," she said. "Let's say that I am not convinced that it is an illusion or in any other way not real, so I would say I am inclined to believe that reality exists more so than that it doesn't. If I had to guess, I would say that it is real." "It's as good a guess as any," he said. "All right, my love, what makes something real?" "Mass, energy, gravity, and so on, no?" She walked backwards in front of him as he strolled, looking up at him as his mask blocked the sun from her eyes. "Well, you are in the right field, but I was thinking along a different path. Let me instead ask this." He thought for a moment. "When you physically interact with something, anything, what are you actually doing? What's happening at the point of contact on a microscopic scale? Have I ever told you this before, how objects don't actually touch one another?" "I don't remember in great detail," she said, "but you just gave me the answer. So when things touch, they don't actually touch. You're talking about the nuclear forces of atoms. It's the strong nuclear force, right?" "Yes, precisely," he said. "And what propagates this force?" "Well, time and the motion of the electrons, the overall energy of the atom, just the presence, the mass of the atom itself, I suppose," she said, still walking backwards, ears pointed high. "And the various field lines, also very important. Okay, now my love," he said, "how do you find an electron? How do you divine the location and spin and other properties of a unique electron? I promise, I'm going somewhere with this. Just let me walk you there." He could see that she was getting impatient, She'd stopped right in front of him, folded her arms across her chest, and started tapping her foot on the ground when he'd asked her how to find an electron. He was going to lose her if he didn't pull her back quickly. She snapped one of her ears and tilted her head to convey attitude and said, "How about you just tell me what kind of insanity you're talking about this time?" "Very well," he said. 3 words, Lylan. Here are 3 words that are about to challenge your concept of what is and is not real. Wave-particle duality. He expected a bigger reaction, but instead she stared blankly at him for a moment and said, "I'm not impressed so far, Hemhut. What do you mean wave-particle duality? Are you telling me that all particles are waves and all waves are particles? So what? What's that supposed to mean to me?" "No, more like a wave is the defining property of a particle, and a particle is the defining property of a wave. The wavelength defines where a particle could be, and the energy of the particle defines the bandwidth of the wave. Particles in motion, even those that comprise your fingertips, follow trajectories predicted by patterns of wave propagation with the wavelength proportional to the particle's energy. They do not travel in straight lines as one would intuit or in free orbits. This is why bonded electrons are restricted to orbital planes around a nucleus and cannot travel between the orbital planes, but seem to vanish and then reappear on the next plane. The possible orbital paths for electrons correspond with the most probable locations of the electron. The spaces in between the pathways represent places where the wavelength is at its most narrow and where the particle is least likely to be. This restricts the possible location of the particle to places where the corresponding wave is elongated and narrows the probable location down. But it is not possible to predict the exact location where one will find a particle along the length of the wave, only where it is most likely and least likely to be. This means that particles behave like waves until they don't, until the wave function is collapsed, and then they organize as defined particles. Until then, the wave represents the particle. Pretty crazy, right? Hemhut's enthusiasm faded as she looked at him scornfully. "Hemhut, I have no idea what you are talking about. First, you need to start over from the beginning, and then you still need to tell me why I should care. Why this is apparently so mind-blowing to you, because nothing you've said has sent me into any intellectual crisis. The way you were talking, I thought you were going to reveal some kind of paradox or mystery far beyond the behavior of particles." She climbed him and sat upon her perch. "I think maybe you've overthought this one, Hemhut." "But don't you see," he said, "this not only means that at the smallest levels the arrangement of reality itself is probabilistic and not deterministic, it also means that even the thoughts in your head, your means of interpreting reality, are guided by probability, that even ideas one believes to be their own are actually the result of randomized arrangements of the placement of the subatomic particles at work in your nervous system as you are thinking, and the arrangements are completely unpredictable. In other words, your thoughts are not even the work of your efforts so much as they are the reception of unseen, unpredictable influences. Why do you think your mind wanders? Why don't you have more control over your own thoughts, or choose what to remember or to forget or how to feel? Because, among other traditional macroscopic reasons, the electron discharge from your neurons inside your brain, which comprise thought, is subject to the same principles that restrict particles to only probable location and orientation upon interaction with interfering waves, and its behavior can never be accurately predicted. The resulting observation of this, Lylan, is that no thinking entity is as in control of itself as it may believe, and their fates may be, in fact, completely guided by the random distribution of particles resulting from the properties of their respective wave functions and subsequent collapse. This, of course, begs the question, if we are not in control of ourselves, is someone or something else in control in our stead? Furthermore, it seems improbable that everything everywhere is simply the result of random interactions going back to the beginning of time. It just seems unlikely to me that you could throw all the pieces of a puzzle into a box, shake it up, open it, and find that the puzzle pieces have all fallen into place to construct a completed puzzle. In all likelihood, the universe should have ended up incoherent, and certainly nothing bearing intelligent life capable of ensuring its existence as it did by creating me. Wave-particle duality gives rise to legitimate arguments for the possibility that the universe is the result of intelligent design. For from irreconcilable disorder there arose stability, against near staggeringly insurmountable odds. It could have been that I, on some subconscious level, shaped the universe the way that I wanted it. I did no such thing consciously, but it's seemingly certain that I did somehow mold reality into its form. Because either random configuration somehow resulted in the formation of everything, or the configurations were not random. In any case, the probability of the universe having become that which we perceive it is to be is negligible, infinitesimal, and practically non-existent. I mean, you are literally talking about odds of 1 over infinity. Existence as we know it, as a stable structure, is mathematically impossible. By that logic, perception is false, and combined with the understanding that we are not the least bit in control of our life experiences or perception, it is most likely that none of this is true. If logic prevails, then none of this is real. Yet, here we seem to be. Okay, you've intrigued me, but I'm going to need some of that Leboan manga if you're going to keep going on this, and you're going to have to go way back, she said. Why is it that the positions of particles are random, and what is it about a wave that dictates where a particle can and cannot be? Why wouldn't it just be able to form anywhere along the wavelength? So long as it is undisturbed, it can. But once it interacts with itself, an interference pattern forms where the waves create peaks and valleys. The peaks and valleys being the combined energy of the two merging waves where the wavelength elongates, and then an area between the combined waves where they cancel one another out, where the peak of one meets the valley of another and they level out. The probability of the particle existing where the wavelength is most elongated is high, and the probability of the particle existing in the areas where the waves cancel one another out is low. This allows you to know the likelihood of the location of a particle, but still without certainty, not until it is located definitively, almost as if particles are restricted to the threads of an unseen fluctuating web. Unfortunately, for the full potential of a given wavelength to express the location of a particle, it would have to be isolated, and the quantum realm which pervades reality is literally seething with particles, making it practically impossible for the wavelength of any particle, a photon, an electron, and so on, to continue to propagate unmolested. Interference is written into the underlying code of the universe, Helmholtz said. This is one of the core concepts of quantum physics. Single particles traveling in waveform even interfere with themselves if their corresponding wave is disturbed, and the position of any particle is not defined, not measurable until the wave function collapses. She stared at him and shook her head, still perched on his shoulder. Then she said, "I hate you. What on Tawala are you trying to do to my head? The next words I want to hear from you are here, smoke, and this. Until then, you are not allowed to talk. Quantum physics? Seriously, Helmholtz. Take me to the mungaweed right now. I swear, I don't know where you come up with this stuff. Come to think of it, I didn't ask you about wave functions and probability. What did I ask you?" He waited for a moment, and then he said, "You asked me how the amalgamator works. It has everything to do with eliminating the probability factor, capturing information about the true states of particles by intentionally collapsing the wave functions of several particles simultaneously in order to record the exact superposition of the component parts of that which it dissolves. It had to be done in separate phases, executed in extremely rapid succession in order to ensure the safety of the Tawalans. They will not be exactly the same when reconstructed, with subtle differences at the atomic level due to the probability factor. But their baser components were always probabilistic at an atomic level, so their bodies at the macroscopic scale will think nothing at all has happened. It uses information recorded during the disintegration process to reverse engineer and reconstruct the object in question almost exactly as it was prior to disintegration, almost like playing a song backwards to rewind it. I'll show you a presentation of the double slit experiment tonight against the night sky. It can be demonstrated with any particle. The wave-particle duality is everywhere and truly describes everything. Anything at all can be used to prove this fundamental principle of existence, provided it is divided into very small components, even some fairly massive molecules. I'll show you using electrons and photons as they were used so often to demonstrate the principle on my homeworld. And I'll show you all the varying ways that in which it is evident, and the different ways in which to perform the experiment which yield evidence of the phenomenon in startlingly different ways. It was once quite the conundrum as to why the results of this experiment were so different depending on whether or not the wave functions were collapsed by measurement or not, but I will show you tonight why this happens. You are not supposed to be talking. You're being punished. She smacked him on the back of the head playfully, and he laughed as he carried her toward the dwindling stores of Lobo and Munga. His laugh was quieted and then silenced when he caught sight of the distant ice sheet through a gap in 2 hills on the landscape. He'd almost forgotten his situation, and for a moment had almost believed that she was real again, but she was not. Hamlet was alone.